Good morning, everybody. I guess we'll go ahead and jump in. If you were in our session yesterday, just know that I will be recording this one as well, just so that all of our graduating seniors who were unable to make this event will still have access to be able to see the great information that we're going to be covering today. So again, my name is Corey McGregory, and today we're going to be going through the career boot camp session for how do I engage in a successful interview. Of course, this is something I meet with students with quite often. Some people have more experience with interviews. Some people have, less experience with them. So I definitely think it is a good topic to cover because no matter where you are, a lot of people have concerns about interviewing. It's certainly something that may even cause an anxiety point. Um, no one likes to be judged, and that's essentially an interview that's they're kind of summing us up. So it's important that we think about how am I preparing for interviews, and also really trying to get into the mind of the employer in the sense of what are they really trying to ask. So we'll cover a lot of different points today that revolve around having that successful interview. If you can, I'm going to drop something in chat, but basically just letting you know to please leave your UHCL email address. That way, I can officially check you in, and of course, send you any supplemental documents that we will have after our session today. And lastly, before we jump right in, is also if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to drop them in chat, and I will be sure to be. I'll be checking periodically, but definitely at the end, I'll be sure to have time to look at questions. All right. So let's go ahead and we'll jump in here. So successful interviewing. Um, First things first, I do want to give some insight into what's the inside scoop. What are some of the major things to know about? And a lot of this is just kind of things to consider, things to really think about as you are preparing generally for this big thing. So interviewing, first of all, a lot like I said with resumes, on Monday, uh, interviewing is a marketing pitch. It's not just like here's who I am, but here's who I am and what I bring to the table that can really benefit this organization. So again, it's you may say it's not really like a huge difference between the two, but I mean I would argue that it can drastically change how we respond. And this kind of relates to point four, but a lot of people that I've worked with and done practice with is sometimes they just answer the question and directly. And this may sound counterintuitive, but we don't always just want to answer the question. We want to answer the question with that marketing in mind. The idea of what's my professional brand? How do I project my skills out in this interview room? So definitely having very much intentionality with it, not necessarily just answering questions outright. Um, and I'll definitely talk through that a little bit more later whenever we do cover, a couple of example interview questions and generally what they're looking for. Segue into focus on your branding. So we'll talk a little bit about this later, but essentially your branding is your professional brand. It's the idea of what are the characteristics I want these folks to take away from me through my interview. And this can often be a really good starting foundational point for people trying to build a strong, cohesive interview. Basically, think about what are like three things that I really want to show off. Like if I want to show off as a career counselor that I of course am professional. I'll say charismatic. I'll go that far. Um, and that I'm a helper. A helper is a big part of my brand. Then if I have those three ideas in mind, then I am able to think about the possible interview questions that I may receive and think about how can I shape my responses to really center around that branding. That way, whenever the interview's over, I hopefully I've implanted that professional brand in their mind that when they think Corey, they think those three things. So the other point, strike the balance in response length. I've seen all across the board. Um, some people they talk. They provide very short responses. They're very to the point, answering questions. But and this can be problematic, especially if you have like an hour-long interview and you get done in like 15 minutes. Probably not a good thing. Probably you definitely want to try and maximize the time that you do have, and of course adjust that accordingly, right? Like if you have a lot of initial interviews, they may be more like 30 minutes. So of course we don't want to provide a 45-minute to an hour interview approach to a 30-minute interview process, because that's going to eventually have us feeling very rushed. We may spend too much time on questions, so that it may put pressure on the hiring committee to get through all their questions. So, big part of being cognizant of what are my time requirements really look like. Uh, the other thing, so as far as actually the hiring committee being present in the interview response, so striking the balance and response length, yes, that's important to make sure that you are balancing out being precise, but also giving enough details to where I have a good idea what that looked like. Like you don't want to be so concise that I feel like I didn't really get any details. So it's kind of a balancing act. Like I said, and this is interview practice. This is also actual interviews I've been on the hiring committee side. Um, I've had folks where they just gave very short responses, and like I said, just kind of felt like I didn't really get a whole lot of information from them. I really didn't learn a lot about their skills and the things that they've done, because it was more short and sometimes a little bit more general. But I've also had folks where they just kind of keep talking. They don't necessarily have a game plan. They're just kind of chasing squirrels with their conversation, to the point where, it's the tell me about yourself question. We've spent like 20 minutes with them talking about stuff. And it gets to the point where I almost have to look down at the paper and go, what question are we on? So you definitely don't want to do that. So a good idea is always, when you're doing practice, to try timing yourself, considering that most people will talk a little faster in an interview. And so that way you can kind of gauge before the big interview, you can gauge how am I lining up with this timing. Because likely if you're hitting that timing pretty accurately, then that increases the chances that you are giving enough details, but also being concise enough. All right, so consider your answers as they relate to the employer. We already kind of talked about this a little bit with the marketing pitch. Again, it's not just enough to answer the question. We have to think about what is the employer looking for, which will try and push that mindset as we look at questions later. The other thing, and this is more of a confidence boost, because I meet with so many folks that they have imposter syndrome, essentially. Like they feel like, oh, this interview is going to be terrible. They're going to see right through me. They're going to see that I'm not qualified for X, Y, and Z. And I'm here to tell you that 99.999% of the time, they've looked at your resume and they thought that you were worth interviewing anyway. So my point with that is I try and tell that to people to try and shift the mindset, because when you're in an interview, you don't need that kind of in your psychological space. You don't need to be worrying about, are they going to see that I'm qualified or not, because they've already seen you on paper. At that point, it's just giving more details, and a lot of times they're checking, like, do you line up with the culture of our organization, of our people? Are we going to synergize well? So again, try and think about that. If you find that that's something that you're going into the interview room with, just try and center yourself on the fact that they've looked at your resume, and on paper, they thought you were qualified enough to bring in for an interview. Because I'm going to tell you right now, again, being on the hiring committee side, I am not just volunteering to do more interviews with folks, right? If I'm interviewing someone, that means that they had potential that I saw. So, and that's generally the consensus in all industries. People are very likely not going to waste their time with a bunch of interviews extra for people that aren't qualified. So hopefully that helps from a confidence standpoint a little bit. There we go. So a big part with interviewing is it's so much of it is in the preparation. It's how do I get this stuff ready? How do I organize myself for the interview? Such a big part is gonna be research. Uh, Absolutely, if there's an organization and a job that you are really like, you almost want to put all your eggs in that basket, absolutely research it. Research it. Look into at the very least, even if it's not the dream job, really know what the job description entails. Really read over that. Look into it. You definitely want to look at the company or organization website. You can think about their website, social media, different ways to kind of see what is this company or organization about. Um, that's also important. And I can't remember if this was one of the questions later, but just know I have never been in an interview where they didn't ask essentially, what do you know about us? So that already entails that I want to do enough research to be able to answer that question. Like there was one time I was in a committee. This was a different university in Texas, and we were hiring folks. And of course, the person received that question, "What do you know about us?" And the person basically responded, "I know you're based in Texas," and that was kind of the extent of that answer. So for us, I felt like with an answer like that, it feels like you're looking for a job, not this job. And if there are other competitors, other interviewers that are conveying the message that I want this one, not just a one, then that's going to turn the committee's heads a little bit more. Common interview questions and answers. So a good tip to help you with that is, depending on the organization, especially if it's a bigger organization, sometimes you can look up companies and organizations on a website called Glassdoor. People commonly utilize that one for job searching, but it also kind of has a rate my professor for companies, which is good to kind of see what's the culture kind of look like. But also employees, both current and past, will often post interview questions that they received. So it's not surefire, but that's kind of a next level prep that you could consider beyond just the kind of more traditional questions that people typically try and prepare for. Another thing you could try now, again, I always tell people to take this one with a grain of salt because AI is great, but AI is still developing. Um, it is a good idea generator. So sometimes what you could do is you could prompt like ChatGPT, Gemini, whatever AI program you're wanting to use, and basically just say, based on the job posting copied below, can you provide me with possible interview questions? And, you know, I've kind of played around with that before. Some of them were really bad. I think I did one for career counseling because I'm a career counselor, so I know exactly what type of questions would come up. Some of them were bad. Some of them were like, I feel like those you can intuitively tell though that they weren't great. And then there were others where I was like, oh yeah, that is a good question. I would totally ask that. So that may be a way to try and investigate maybe some more knowledge based questions that may come up, because a lot of the common interview questions, that's not so much on the knowledge based area. So that may be a good strategy to help kind of fish some of those up. And then just some of this other information, like you can look up team and leaders, try and get a sense of who you might be meeting with, who you'd be working with. Location and directions, absolutely important. Um, Absolutely important because again, not to keep pulling from my experience, but I feel like it's valuable information. I've been part of an interview process where the candidate did not know where our office was, and they were I think it was only like 5 minutes late, but this person was frantic. They were, of course they're panicking. They're like, I'm not making a great impression being late to this interview. And what happened was, is they actually fell down the stairs somewhere. We only found out because they told us at the start of the interview and they were catching their breath. So even though they weren't super late, it's them not knowing exactly how to get to our office caused them to struggle to find it, and then of course get into and that person, I can tell you, they when they conducted that interview, it took them a little bit to get back into to get into the mode, get into the mindset. So don't definitely look up location. Be sure you know the directions. That way you don't have that leaving you frazzled as you start the interview. And then just company needs. Now, as far as what do I actually come to an interview with, it's typical to come with copies of your resume. So they may likely have them, but it's just good practice just in case, because there may be the hiring manager had the resume, but maybe the other committee members didn't. So generally speaking, just I recommend it. Also, come with questions to ask. We'll cover this a little bit later, but long story short, absolutely come with questions to ask them. And what you can even do for that is you can have like a little notepad or Padfolio, have those questions written down. That way, whenever it comes to your part of the interview to ask them some questions, you can just flip that open and look at those questions that way. But that being said, I'll give one more disclaimer about a Padfolio and notepad. Do not take notes to read off of for the interview. I've seen this happen, and understandably, that person was probably coming from the mindset of, I really care about this job and I don't want to miss anything. I don't want to miss some of this important information I want to relay to them. However, how it can be interpreted is, well, you crafted this nice response, but it may not feel as connected to, well, if it's really true for you, why couldn't you just say it? So again, there's some optics with that, but I just wanted to give that shout out as we were talking about Padfolios a little bit. All right, so ask yourself first. So these are areas where you can kind of think about, what does my professional brand look like? So just, and also, just like last time, I will send out these slides so that you'll be able to look through all of this content. Again, you don't necessarily have to remember 100% of everything I talk about throughout this entire presentation. You'll get the slides. So these are possible questions you can think about. Why do you want this job? That's a good way to try and lean into, what's my mission? How do I use that to talk about the tasks that I want to do? Why should they hire you over competition? So that kind of relates to the third one. What are my relevant skills, abilities, experiences? What are my strengths, my challenges, or areas for growth? What are my professional goals? How can this align with that? That's something absolutely worth thinking about. And then, kind of having all of this in mind, this is why it's so good to research companies, because then as you're thinking about what you bring to the table, you can more accurately connect it to the company research, the company needs. You can think about, okay, well, here's this skill. Here's why this skill matters for this role. So all of that really flows into itself very nicely. So we are moving into an age, or we've actually been into an age, courtesy of COVID, especially that not video presentations, video interviews are fairly common. So this is just some stuff to think about. Test your technology. I always make the joke that there's never, it's not a Zoom meeting unless we have some technical difficulties first. So absolutely steer into that, in the sense of, try your mic before, test your camera, make sure that your mic and camera are connected to the right devices so they're working accurately. Do sound checks, because again, it's all about, I don't want you to get frazzled. And if you get in with them and they're like, I can't hear you, you can bet that most people that I meet with, they're going to get frazzled by that, because they're going to be stressing of, okay, what's the problem? How do I fix it? And so just testing, it's a good way to jump in front of that. Really set the scene by minimizing distractions. So I don't know about y'all. I'm sometimes very distractible. So, and I don't kick myself, but we have to learn, okay, how do I work through that? How do I know myself, how do I operate in that setting? So, for instance, I turn my phone off. I make sure if I'm doing it at my desk that there's no like clutter around my desk. So whatever that looks like for you, and that's also not just for you, also in the background, kind of paying attention to what does my background show. Because if I have like a whole bunch of crazy posters behind me as I'm interviewing, it's not just for you; it's for the interviewers as well. That they, you don't want them trying to figure out what your poster says. You want them focusing in on what you are saying. So that's kind of a double-edged reason why we want to lean into that second one. Sit down prepared. Try not to be in a space where you have to get back up. This is an important one. This fourth one, actually, the fourth and fifth are very important, and they are very common. Issues that I have seen. Practice, don't memorize. Kind of like it sounds, pretty straightforward. The problem with memorizing is that usually memorizing feels like it was memorized. And if it feels like it was memorized, and again, it can possibly chip away at how authentic is this. So practicing it allows for a more organic, just kind of letting that information out there. That's why I always tell people, if you're writing out responses, don't write out exact like a script. Write out bullet points. What are the major points I want to hit? And that also is beneficial. If they ask a question that is slightly different, but different enough from one that you've already prepared, you're going to struggle a lot more to flex that response if you memorized an exact response compared to memorizing, right? I guess I'll say memorizing bullets, but you know what I mean. So that's going to be a much better approach because it's going to allow you to better flex that response a little bit as needed. Already mentioned this, turn your phone all the way off. Definitely don't want that distraction. And then logging on early is also good. That's kind of lined up with testing your technology, but just generally really good practice there. All right. So some other stuff to know. I need to be friendly and engaged. So what are the things I need to be thinking about as I am, thinking about how do I do that? So communication, of course, we know there's nonverbal and verbal. So this kind of covers both of those areas. Sometimes for nonverbal, what I'll recommend to folks, not just timing, well, this will actually time it for you as well, but possibly recording yourself going through it. That way you can kind of see, and I might even recommend doing it with someone else. That way it's a little bit more accurate with your actual nonverbals, because your nonverbals alone with a camera may look different with your nonverbals talking to somebody. So that can be a good way to assess what's my smile look like. What's my eye contact? Am I staring through this person's soul? Am I looking at everything but them? Or am I having a nice blend of all of that? Am I slouching? What's my posture look like? Am I making funny faces at times whenever I think about things? Um, and what's my attention level look like? Another one really related to that, to nonverbals, is recording can also help you catch some of those. I guess I could say like nervous ticks, like sometimes I know some folks where they'll like wring their hands a lot, and I've seen some where it's just a little bit, but I notice like it's a little distracting. But there's been others where they look like they're about to break some fingers. Um, so absolutely, and a lot of those folks don't even recognize that they're doing it. So absolutely something worth considering for a strategy to help you prepare is to record. That way you can see, am I doing any of that stuff? And if I am, don't kick yourself. Think about what can I do. So a lot of times for those folks that wring their hands, what I tell them is try and integrate moving your hands around a little bit as you're speaking. That way you're engaging your hands, you're releasing that energy, but you're doing it in a more productive way for communication compared to, being more of a nervous tick that kind of shines out a little bit more of that anxiety in the moment. So some verbal stuff. So big one. I've come across this. Don't speak over the interviewer. You think about any time that you're talking with someone and they speak over you. Most people don't like that. So if I'm an interviewer and I'm asking you a question, let me finish the question. Don't like jump in right out the gate, and especially make sure it's not a pattern. I think sometimes accidents happen. Sometimes we jump in a little early. That's fine. But if it's a consistent pattern, then that is sending a message to the committee. So be aware of, am I letting them finish their thoughts before I start jumping into mine? Ask questions. Again, we'll cover this a little later, but definitely ask questions. Generally, I recommend, don't necessarily do it throughout, but usually at the end of an interview, they will ask you, do you have questions for us? So that's going to be a suitable time to do that. And then just think about, how can I be gracious? Am I saying thank you to things? Am I giving a warm hello, warm goodbye whenever I'm entering and leaving? Other stuff, just balance out. Be yourself. You want to be your authentic self. I tell people the authentic professional self. Be confident, be relaxed. That goes such a long way. That confidence is really such a big part. And that's why I also recommend, if anyone is really worried about this, about interviewing, this is really a party starter. We can absolutely do, a mock interview or practice interview. That way we get you that hands-on practice. And there's been a lot of folks where they feel nervous, but I don't experience them that way. And so, that's something that we can assess, we can talk through, but generally these are all going to be very important things to consider. So now we get into attire. So this gets to be tricky business. What kind of professional attire should I go for? Now this is for female. These first groups are going to be for female identifying. This is your smart casual look. This is sometimes, this may be suitable for the workplace, but I would not recommend this level for interviewing as a standard. Business casual. So for this one is a little bit closer. You may have some interviews where this is appropriate attire. Generally, this is going to lean more into being a little bit more compliant with typical work attire. But for an interview, the best thing that you could really consider is trying to strive for more business formal. So basically more of that suit look, if able. That's going to be the best case. And just to kind of put context behind that, I think I've worn a suit while working here, and I've worked here for almost coming up on 3 years. And I think I've worn a suit maybe like 5 times. So not a lot. Generally speaking, I wear button-ups, I wear polos, I wear dress pants. That's usually kind of more of the, I guess you could say, like the smart casual side. That's actually more the level I typically sit at with my day-to-day attire. But you can bet for my interview, I came in a suit. So a lot of people say dress for the job you want, dress beyond the job you want, kind of overshoot it a little bit. That way, because it's better to be a little overdressed than to be underdressed. That's a good thing to follow. So same thing with male identifying. We have our smart casual. Like I said, this is a little bit more in line with what I would wear day to day on the job. That is typically a little bit more where it's at. This is not, again, similar to the female identifying. This is really not a level I would recommend attending an interview with if you can help it. This, again, business casual, same principle. This gets a little bit closer to the mark. blazer, dress pants, both kind of different variations, different colors there, and your dress shoes. So this one, honestly, with this one, if you added a tie, this one would probably be pretty okay. Albeit, I don't know if I'd recommend those bright pink socks, but other than that, um, yeah, I would definitely consider this a little bit more with that tie. And of course, golden standard, this is really going to be the best option to help you think about what should I wear for an interview. It's going to be this business formal. All right, so it appears we have a slide repeat, so I'm going to go past that one. So let's get to questions. Let's talk through what are some of the major questions that you may come across during an interview. So tell me about yourself. I've always heard that one. People want to know. It's kind of like the introductory question. A lot of times people will go around, if there's a hiring committee, they'll introduce themselves, and then they'll basically ask you, tell us about yourself. And so that'll kind of be the segue into the interview itself. A lot of times people stress out about this question. They're just like, I'm a complex person. I don't know what to say. This was one where I've had someone spend like 20 to 25 minutes on it, and then the rest of their interview was super short because they pretty much gave it all. So, for tell me about yourself, I want you to think about it as an introduction. It is not meant to show all the cards you have on the table. It's really just to introduce. Now, what you can think about, and we're going to talk about elevator pitch. An elevator pitch is basically it's a strategy you would utilize if you went to a career fair, of course, for the interview and the tell me about yourself question. It's not just an elevator pitch; it's also called a 30-second commercial. Now, it doesn't have to be 30 seconds on the dot, but the idea is that it's more brief. It's a brief introduction, introduces some of those themes. So for this one, you can consider, of course, start with your name. That one may feel more intuitive with people you don't know, but sometimes they'll call you back and then you won't think to restate your name. It's just good practice when you get to this point where they ask you, tell me about yourself, restate your name. Of course, being a recent graduate, following that up with the major that you graduated with is also a pretty good strategy. And then just think about, what are two brief takeaways you want for the employer to know about your professional mission or major tasks? And then can wrap it up of, why do you want the role? Why do you spend? And don't dive too deep into that question, because that's sometimes also a question that they'll specifically ask. So be prepared to just introduce why you want the role, and then be prepared to say more about it later. I would tell people, it could be like 45 seconds or so, but I think a 2 to 3, possibly 3 minute response would be pretty appropriate for this one. So that's kind of a good time window to go for. And that's going to introduce things without, again, showing all your cards on the table and then impacting the length of your responses later. Oh, jump on that. Oh, no, I did mean to jump on that. Okay. Yeah. So this right here, steps to consider. So this goes through the steps of how I might recommend going through an elevator pitch. There's not always a hard and fast, this is how you have to do it. But I think it's a good starting point to consider, what types of things do I want to show off. So for me, I might say something like, hi, my name is Corey McGregory. I am a higher education professional who has worked primarily in both career counseling and academic advising. My passion is really in assisting with student career success and development, helping students become ready and help them find the job they love. I'm interested in this specific career services department because I believe in your student-centered mission. So that's just a little bit about me, but definitely looking forward to the rest of the interview. So something adjacent to that. You could find a different way to close it if you wanted to as well, which provides a side tip. So sometimes an experience that I do notice with folks, let's see, let me copy and paste that in chat. So something that I notice with folks is that sometimes they will be talking and then they're like, "Uh-oh, I'm still talking. I don't know how to end this." And then sometimes that creates this feeling of like it just ends. It just stops. And sometimes interviewers will be like, "Are you finished?" "Oh, okay." So to help minimize that, it's kind of like a pull in case of emergency tactic. If you find that that's happening and you're like, the train's running out of tracks, I need to close this thing out, sometimes it is appropriate to just restate the question, like I did with mine. Like, that's a little bit about myself, and that's a little bit about my strengths. Whatever that question is, you can flip it back. Now, the only thing is that I would not recommend doing that for every single question, but like I said, it is a good one to lean on to if you feel pressured in the sense of I don't know how to close it, but gotta end it somehow. Okay, there we go. So why are you interested in this position or industry? So I'm gonna be honest. I usually sometimes you'll see industry, but I generally dominantly see why are you interested in this position a little bit more. And this question is actually one of the ones that's not a trap. It's pretty straightforward. They really just want to know, why are you interested in this? Why does it matter for you? Um, yeah, they honestly just want to know if you're an interested candidate. So this one's pretty straightforward. I would just reflect on and think about, why am I actively going for this role? If you are somebody, which I know many of us are, we like to eat, sleep under a roof. We like to make money. Um, Making money could be the right answer for this, but that's not the well, it could be a correct answer, but it's not the right answer. It's not the answer we want to lean into. So to really help with that, I would just say, even if there's a job where you're like, uh, I mean, ideally you're pursuing something there is a level of passion behind, but certainly people sometimes they follow the money and they're like, I'll be passionate about things outside of work. Um, if that's the case, we'll still think about what are the things that I can get behind with this job. Even if I'm not like, I don't wake up, live, and breathe this specific thing, what are some of those tasks that I do think, hey, that is a little bit more on the interesting side? And so just try and lean into it that way if you find that you are struggling to answer this one. Um, a lot easier to answer if you are super passionate about what you're going for, but that's a good strategy you can use if that's not necessarily the case. Tell me about a time you made a mistake. What happened and what did you learn from it? So for this one specifically, I would definitely say, pick a mistake that you feel is interview appropriate. So, for instance, if I am applying, let me see what's a good example here. If I'm applying for, like, we'll say some type of medical administration role, healthcare admin of some type. That's a big thing where HIPAA is a very big deal. Which, for those of y'all that aren't super familiar with HIPAA, that is essentially healthcare related confidentiality. Um, so let's just say that you worked at a previous clinic and your mistake is that you accidentally violated HIPAA. Um, that that may not want to be the one that we run with if it's something that's super prominent about your job. So first is evaluating, what's a mistake that's going to be more of a glancing blow than than a killing blow. We don't want that. Also, make sure it doesn't contradict your professional brand. So I see it sometimes for this one. I see it for other ones as well. That would be like, if I am spending the time talking about how I am a great communicator, but the mistake I had was directly seated in communication, there was a communication failure, then it kind of chips away from that brand. It kind of chips away from that strength. Now, just know this variation is really nice. They don't always ask, what did you learn from it? That can sometimes be a good strategy to lean into to end out some of these, we'll call them behavioral questions. So behavioral questions, the tell me about a time questions, those basically came into play to replace hypotheticals. You'll still get hypotheticals sometimes, but generally speaking, there's a consensus that if you ask a hypothetical, it encourages an idealistic response. If you ask a behavioral question like this one, you tell historical data. So, and they believe that how you did something in the past or engaged in something in the past will often be relevant towards how you would handle something moving forward. So what you learn from it also, again, like I said, can be a very good way to add some solid spin on it. And that's honestly where we want to spend really most of our time here is what did you learn from it? That's going to be the case for any question that we would really perceive as negative is we state what the mistake was. We talk about what really happened from that. And then we talk about, okay, well, how did it turn out? And sometimes it's not, butterflies and rainbows. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. But what I learned from that experience can be very powerful. And that's where we want to spend most of our time with this response is doing that spin towards how did I learn, how did I grow from it? Because that's really what they're looking for. They're not looking for dirt on you. They want to know, are you somebody that you can learn from your mistakes? Or probably even looking for how do you receive feedback is probably something else that they may be trying to look into with this question. So to help you with, and I'll send you a document that talks about this STAR method a little bit more, to help you think about how do I answer behavioral questions, all the tell me about a time questions. We use the STAR method, which I'm just going to plop these all up here. So STAR method stands for situation, task, action, result. And in the PowerPoint I'm going to send you, I do include notes on this slide so you can see, okay, what is this really talking about? So the first two, situation and task, those are basically setting the scene. Situation is generally this type of thing happens. Task is one time this specific thing happens. So they're both setting the scene, but it's going from general to more specific. And that's a very important phase to shift into because if you stay in the situation scene, often your response to this will not be super specific, which there are some interviewers that are sometimes more okay with less specifics, but there are also ones that they really, really need those specifics and they may even call you out on, well, what did you do? So action, kind of like you'd think action is, well, what did I do? What were these steps I took in this specific scenario? Result feels intuitive, how did it turn out? But we can also, this is where we can plug in that, well, what did I take away? What did I learn? And this can be a really good thing. Like if I'm talking about a customer service experience as a server, there may be parts of that story that absolutely don't relate to the job I'm interviewing for. But if I process the end of it, thinking about, well, my takeaway from this scenario was X, Y, and Z, and that is absolutely beneficial towards this role because, X, Y, Z, you're connecting it. So you're talking about what you take away from it, and then you're connecting it to why that matters for the role. So that's a good example of kind of a marketing spin on these sort of responses here. So this one, describe a situation where you had to work with someone who was difficult. How did you handle it? This is absolutely one I would prepare for. It may not be asked exactly like that, but generally speaking, most interviews I come across do ask some type of managing conflict sort of questions. Sometimes it's an employee, a fellow employee. Sometimes it's a manager. Other times it may be a customer, just kind of depending on the role. But just a good idea to really think this one through. And the other point I want to make about it is absolutely avoid emotionally charged scenarios. I have personally seen, this hasn't happened so much in the actual interview, but certainly has happened in some of the practice interviews I've conducted. And, a lot of students, they'll answer the question. Here was a time I worked with someone who was very difficult. But then they kind of get stuck on, and I think there's a difference between stating the difficulty and trashing somebody. We definitely don't want to do the latter. And if it's a very emotionally charged scenario, that may come out. You might struggle to not project that anger in a sense. So absolutely think through that as you are thinking through possible situations. Is it one where I feel like I can talk about it really easily without getting mad? And that's a big part because that can throw you off, not just for that question. People think like, oh, it could just impact that question, but the problem is, the more emotionally charged it is, the more mad you may get. The more mad you may get, it's not going to go away immediately. A lot of those folks that was the case, they struggled for at least the next 2 or 3 questions to kind of stabilize back to seeming more centered. So definitely, that's an important one to prepare for and think about for sure. Describe 3 of your strengths. Sometimes you'll get. Sometimes they'll ask for 1, but generally speaking, I've seen 1 to 3. So I think if you prepare for 3, that's going to be pretty good. Which also makes sense because these 3 strengths essentially can be conceptualized as, well, what's that professional brand? So it's not like you necessarily have to remember all these lists. This list is kind of the same list as the professional brand one we talked about. I think one of the biggest things I see with this one is that people will say like, "Oh, I'm an excellent leader," and then it's mic drop. Like that's it. That's all I'm going to say is that's one of my strengths. And the problem is anyone can just state like this is a strength. Employers want to know, how did that present itself? What does that really look like? They want, because they have to believe you. Essentially they have to believe you, and they may not believe as much someone just stating something compared to someone who's kind of show and tell, right? So instead of just saying I'm a leader and just leaving it there, think about, okay, well, what has leadership looked like in my life? How have I done that in my school, in internships, other jobs? Like what type of skills have come out through that leadership strength? Now you can take 2 approaches with this. You can be, talking about it from more of a process standpoint, where in a sense you're kind of talking about it a little bit more generally, but you're still giving good details about what it looked like. Compared to, you could also use that STAR method to think about what was the time I used leadership, what did and just follow the STAR method from that. So you have options with that. Again, it's just important to be sure you're giving details to those strengths. They want to believe you about it, so absolutely help them out by giving enough information to really paint the picture. Yeah, absolutely. So, what is your weakness? So, for this one, again, they aren't looking for dirt on you. They want to know that you can identify a deficit and then engage in ways to grow from it. For this one, it's kind of a similar formula. This is honestly a similar formula I recommend for any question that kind of has that negative presentation to it. So for this one, the formula goes, this is my weakness in relation to this job, but this is what I do about it, or this is how I grow from it. And again, we spend more time on that latter part. So, for this one, and we also want to be sure and identify what is a weakness that I feel comfortable stating. Don't just answer the question. Crippling anxiety may be correct, but it is not the right answer. It's not the answer we want to bring out in the interview. So again, and same thing, make sure your weakness does not contradict your strength. So if one of your strengths is that I'm a people person and your weakness is that sometimes people really frustrate you, then those may potentially wear away at each other, decreasing the power of your strength. So that's a big thing to think about with weaknesses, is make sure it doesn't contradict my strengths. Make sure it's a weakness that I do feel comfortable talking about. So one that you could consider that I've thought about, and I've even used this. So there was a point where I was a career counselor, and then I became an academic advisor, and then now I'm of course back in career counseling. So even going from academic advising to my current job, for this question, I actually responded something that leaned into the fact that, well, I think a weakness in relation to this job is that it's been a couple of years since I've had career counseling appointments. Specifically, certainly ones looking at resumes, interviews, um, but during my time in academic advising, I really led the training and led the charge on having those career conversations with our students. What does that process look like? And in my individual work with students, I was always sure to designate time to talk about career goals and be able to refer them to resources to help them find that success and develop into their careers. And I also another benefit is my previous experience. I do have we did use the same assessments that I see y'all utilize in this office. I probably said a little bit more, but that's kind of the meat and potatoes of it. Is this is my weakness, but this is what I do about it. This is what I grow from it. And I took a standpoint of kind of adapting back into a previous role. It may take a little bit for me to get back into the mode of giving career presentations and having hour-long career appointments compared to 30-minute academic appointments. So just kind of consider that may be a potential one. You can totally take that one if you want it. But just think about those things with this one. All right. So this one is often the final, well, it's second to last question often. Tell us why you're the best candidate for this job. The harsher version is why should we hire you? I feel like that one is very hostile. This question can inspire anxiety, but it is honestly the best question you can be asked. It's essentially the opposite of tell me about yourself. It's the closer. This essentially, I tell people a formula you can think about is passion plus skills plus why this job. That can be a good way to think about how do I want to structure a response to this. But really and truly, it is maybe there's stuff that I want to talk about that I didn't get a chance to. There's other stuff I want to say, but really and truly, it's kind of summarizing what are the major things that make me a good fit for this. And another derivative I've seen is what makes you unique from other candidates. Sometimes that mindset can really be difficult to think about because the truth is you don't know who the other candidates are, so you can't actually assert what makes you unique from the others. So if you receive that question again, try and really shift it towards, well, I think what makes me a great fit for this role is, and then just lean more into what do I bring to the table, because it's kind of pointless trying to think about, well, what actually makes me unique, because you don't know. You can't know because they're not going to give you a list and say this is what all these people's strengths are. So just give it your best shot by just saying what you do bring to the table for this one. All right, so this is often the last question. Do you have any questions for us? I already said this before. Absolutely have questions. Also, this is the final slide before the question slide. So if someone does have any questions, you can go ahead and start typing those out or thinking about them. Now for this one, do you have any questions for us? One of the handouts I'm going to give you, email to y'all, does have a list of example questions to ask and example questions you really don't want to ask in an interview. The list of don't asks are pretty short, generally speaking. That's going to be, we don't ask about salary during the interview. The point to talk about salary is more appropriate once a job offer has been made. That's the point where you can engage in that salary negotiation if needed. Now, the other one is benefits, not talking about benefits. The idea is you want to keep the focus on, I'm interested in this job, compared to, you don't want them to think, oh, I'm just in it for the money. Even if you're in it for the money, generally it's just good to think about what other types of questions I can ask to convey interest in that role. But also it's for you too. This could be a good point. Like if you say, I just can't go into some place where they're just going to, right into the frying pan. Like I don't want to go right into it, boots on the ground. I want a place that's going to have a good onboarding process, where there's going to be training, going to be support to help me work into this role and build up my skills. So a good question you could ask is, can you tell me a little bit about what the onboarding process is like for new employees? And if they tell you, well, we hit the ground running, then if that's a deal breaker for you, then you kind of have your answer. Because the truth is, just because you have an interview, just because you're offered a job, doesn't mean you have to accept it. So if you do pick up on any red flags, that is always an option to consider. Now, as far as how many questions, what should that look like? I always tell people prepare 5. That's why it's good to write them down. Prepare 5, but plan to ask 3. Just because 5 is kind of a lot if you ask all those, but they will also likely answer some of those questions along the way. So that way you have a solid 3 that you can hopefully lean into. If I can make one other tip about the questions, a really good one to finish with is, can you tell me a little bit about what the next steps look like in the hiring process? And that's such an important question, as we are unfortunately in this ghost culture, right? Like, if you haven't come across it yet, unfortunately, you very well might. People are just kind of waiting to hear back from employers. So, like, did I not get it? Like, you could just tell me I didn't get it, and I'd prefer that. But what this does is, if you ask them what the next steps are, they'll likely respond something like, oh, well, we're going to finish up interviews today, actually, and you should hear from us, in a week. Well, if a week comes, a week goes, I usually tell people, wait about half a week after what they say. So if they say it's going to be about a week, give it a week and a half, and then send a follow-up email, just kind of checking in and seeing, how the process is going. And then if another week goes by, you don't hear back, then it may be appropriate to mentally kind of, because that's the issue, is people are just left hanging. And I think that's a good strategy to increase the chance that you're going to get more of a sign of, when do I move on, in case it is a place that's just not going to let me know what happened there. So that's definitely one that I've seen happen. Definitely recommend. One side tip, actually, talking about salary negotiation. I know we're almost out of time, but this is a very important one. I said it's not appropriate to ask about salary as the interviewee. Sometimes interviewers will ask about salary. So it's kind of a double standard there. I'm not behind it, but just here to inform you on it. If that is the case, what is a good idea is, don't just give, if you have a set salary you feel good with throwing out there, go for it. But a good rule of thumb I always tell people is, consider what range am I comfortable with. If you can try and give a range instead of a direct number, that's always going to be more beneficial. It's going to give you that wiggle room. I usually tell people, offer a range, and then finish that question with, but I'm of course open to negotiation. That way you say, like, this is kind of the number I'm looking for, which, if you're not really sure how do I get that number, absolutely recommend making a follow-up appointment. We can always talk more through how do I find that salary data, as well as we can even talk about salary negotiation and what that looks like. So definitely wanted to cover that, because that's something that comes up and often surprises people. All right, so the next page is questions, but before that, one last note is, after the interview, I would recommend trying to get contact info for the people that were involved in your interview, if you are able. And then, in the next 24 hours after that, send an email. I've even received a letter before, but email is pretty common. Just thanking them for the opportunity to interview with them, a little thank you letter of sorts. And that's a pretty good strategy to lean into. All right, so I don't see any questions at this point. I think just to, maybe there's a question. Oh, there is a question. I have a question about where we can access the recording of this Zoom meeting from after our meeting. Very good question. So my plan is, of course, I'm recording it. We're going to put the recording on our Career Services YouTube, and then my goal is going to be to send out an email to all the graduating class that has these links, so that you'll be able to access it that way. So that should be forthcoming in the either next couple days this week or early next week. They should come out. All right, good question. So absolutely. So just as last time, here's our contact info. If we're needing to do a deeper dive into interviewing, we can always do that. Always have that conversation. Best and easiest way to make an appointment is going to be calling this phone number here, 281-283-2590. That's going to be our front desk. You just let them know who you are, what you're looking for. They'll ask you maybe a couple more questions to help make the appointment. But we can absolutely do that. And I approach it in a way that scales with what your needs are. So if you're somebody where you've done interviews, you feel like you have pretty good experience, you just want to practice run, we can absolutely do a mock interview where we treat it as if it's an interview for a specific job. Alternatively, if you're somebody that you're like, I have very little working knowledge on interviews, like I super uncomfortable with these, we can do more of an interview coaching model, which is basically I ask you an interview question, you respond to the best of your ability, we hit the pause button and we talk through that response. We process it together and we take it question by question. So it is a support that is available to you. And again, our appointments, they are both in person and Zoom. So if one of those is better for you, we can absolutely accommodate that. Just a reminder, we do have on Friday the session for the Career Bootcamp on job searching. Just some insight into that. We will spend a little extra time talking about LinkedIn, but definitely one worth looking into if you find that you're struggling with the job searching piece.